Hello. Last day of PAX, how's everyone holding up? All right, well, thank you all very much for coming. This is Heroes, Villains, and You, Player Choice in Game Design. My name is Jesse. I'm here on behalf of Paradox Interactive, and I'm here joined by the experts in RPG design from Obsidian Entertainment. So allow me to introduce your panel. To my right is McLean, the lead narrative designer, and you'll be familiar with his work if you have played Fallout New Vegas, Pillars of Eternity, or Alpha Protocol. Yeah, indeed. And you can look forward to his work in the upcoming title, Tyranny. Look for it, buy 12 copies. To his right is Brian Heins, game director, also working on Tyranny. Look for it, buy 800 copies. And you will also be familiar with his work if you have played South Park, The Stick of Truth. On his right is Josh Sawyer, the design director for Obsidian, and you are familiar with his work if you have played Pillars of Eternity, Fallout New Vegas, all the way back to Icewind Dale or Neverwinter Nights 2. Next to Josh is Megan Starks. She is a narrative designer also working on Tyranny, and you may be familiar with her work if you have played Wildstar or Fallen Earth.
Hi.
And finally, on your left and my far right is Deanie McMurry, a level designer who has contributed work to Pillars of Eternity, South Park: The Stick of Truth, Fallout New Vegas, and Dungeon Siege 3. So, RPG design. RPGs, as we all know, can take many forms in and out of video games, from tabletop to tablet to everywhere else. The form that we generally accept, just so we can define what it is that we're talking about as the RPG, usually comes down to two main things. The player controls the actions and decisions of either a central protagonist or a party of characters, and then, based on those players' choices, tactical, emotional, story, or otherwise, the plot is driven forward. So, let's start there. The key factors that define an RPG, whether it's being able to design that character or the freedom of choice to send a character in any direction in an open world, or the story that sucks you in and immerses you and you want to play it forward, there are any number of games that include a variety or exclude some of these features. So, to the experts here, what is the purest expression of the RPG? What must an RPG absolutely have for you personally to want to play through it? Let's start right here with Matt, yes.
I think the term RPG is massively overused. I suppose Diablo 2 is an RPG, and so is like a therapy session with your guidance counselor when they're telling you to take the role of, your abusive uncle or whatever. So the term RPG is just massively overused, and I don't know actually what to make when I hear of all these different games that are called RPGs. For me, the central part is that you take a role of a character who is in the world and not just you're not playing a sandbox god acting on a game. You are an element in the world. You have a role, you have a personality, you have a social standing. Everything else relates to you like it's actually part of that world. That to me is what a good RPG is when you take the role of something in the world. I mean, you could argue that as long as you're taking a role, you're playing a role-playing game, but if your role is just walking forward and shooting things and the world never really reacts to you with a story, that's really not much of an RPG.
Yeah, I guess for me, a lot of modern games have taken a lot of the core RPG elements, like progression systems for characters, and incorporated them. There's few games you can play these days that don't have that element of what used to be, but just RPG systems incorporated into them. So for modern RPGs, it's really about choice and reactivity. There's not a lot of games where you have the ability to make fundamental choices that alter the actual state of the world and characters in a fundamental and meaningful way. And that's kind of what I look for in an RPG, is having a lot of choice options available to the player, a lot of reactivity to those choices from what your decisions you've made, and actually being able to see those affected both in NPCs, companions, and the shape and breadth of the world itself.
Yeah, I'd say by the metric of having an advancement system, a game like Forza could also be considered a role-playing game, so that's kind of a ridiculous standard. I came from a tabletop background, and the most enjoyable time I had in tabletop was when we got to mess with the DM. We had an idea for what our character was in the world, what their personality was like, and how we wanted to behave with relation to the other people in our party and the protagonist and the antagonist that the DM threw at us. And it was our ability to throw things off course or change expectations and see how the world reacted. And that's what we like generally. That's what most players like in a good DM or a GM, is that they react to what you do in a believable way, makes you feel like there are rules that you have to sort of respect and abide by, but you can work within them and play to create a story together. And that's what I want in an RPG that I play, and that's always what I want to do in an RPG that I design.
Hi. So I think for me, the thing that I look for the most, if you boil it down to the most basic element, is the ability to experience something through another person that I can't experience in my real life. So I really like fantastical, like really fun, living vicariously through another person. I think if you have that, like really good story elements, really good character, I'm hooked.
Yeah, I tend to really like the exploring the worlds and stuff of RPGs, and meeting all the different people, and again going along with what they were saying about like being able to like make changes to the world or like characters or like see how things react to like the stuff that you do, and that's usually what draws me into RPGs the most, I think.
Gesundheit. So the common theme that we're hearing from most of you is that it can't just be, okay, I killed a rat and leveled up. There needs to be a role to inhabit, and the choices you make within that role should make a difference to the world. Particularly to Josh's point about, I want to see if we can mess with the DM, and the choices I make can really break the world. And yeah, we generally think of player freedom as a good thing in a game. Now, at a tabletop, you can give the player as much freedom as you want. When it comes to designing a video game RPG, how tricky is that to actually implement and balance? How do you keep a player from simply walking up to the NPC who kicks off the story, shooting them in the back of the head, and still letting them feel like they have the choice to do whatever they want?
It's always a difficult balance. Because you need to have certain key characters and things that happen in order to be able to advance your story, but then you also want to allow for player choice, so then it comes down to trying to make decisions about like how much of the world do we make freeform, how much do we have to make static, and especially in a game like Tyranny, where you have multiple places where you can start off and multiple places where you can end, it can get really challenging and daunting to try and like get all of that to fit together. But it's a lot of it is just kind of doing, like putting together scenarios and then seeing like how well does it work, like do we need to make changes, like do we need to add player choices, do we need to take away player choices. You just got to kind of like reiterate on everything until you get to this nice balance of being able to shoot people in the face that you want to shoot in the face, but not necessarily shooting the wrong people at the wrong time, type thing.
There's certainly the problem that like most conflicts require a villain or usually someone to fight against. So obviously we can create these situations where it's like, oh, you can meet the villain and then you can punch him in the face the first minute you meet them and then there's no game. Congrats. Now if you have the budget, you could certainly do that. Like Far Cry 4 is a really fantastic game. I don't know if you've ever played it, but try not shooting anybody and you can actually beat the game in just a handful of minutes. And it's quite brilliant. They actually took the time to make a pacifistic way to play through the game and you don't shoot anybody. And the game supports that option. So I guess theoretically, if we had all the time and money in the world, we would try to support as many options and as many chances to kill people the first minute you meet them. But we always have to dial it back and find like what's the right number of options, and then when do we actually have to pull it back just so we can keep the story going so the player isn't over in 5 minutes.
I think it's very important to think about player expectation. It could be an expectation due to the title, like the sort of franchise you're working within, or it can be just set. Their expectations can be set very early on in the game. So when we were working on Fallout New Vegas, the original Fallout is one of my favorite games, and you can murder pretty much everyone in there. I think the Overseer, I don't actually know if the Overseer is technically killable. He certainly kills you very quickly if you try to mess with him. But because of that, we had some rules that were established very early in the development of Fallout New Vegas, where you started the game, you're being shot in the head and dropped in a shallow grave, and that you're going to end the game by resolving the Battle of Hoover Dam. And then everything between was John Gonzalez worked out the details, but I said, the conditions are, if the player has free control of gameplay, you must assume that any NPC they have a direct line of sight to can die immediately. And so, and that was a rule. And so people would design quests, and I'm like, assume this character can die as soon as they finish their conversation. And once that expectation was put in place, designers, they would never design things without that assumption. And it was okay. We established for a person, like, if you kill someone, it'll tell you that a quest has failed. That's okay. And then players realized, the game just lets me do this. So I can feel free to do whatever I want. And that doesn't mean that most players actually did go around slaughtering everything, but it did set the expectation for them that at any given point in time, if they wanted to kill someone, they weren't just going to stand back up, they weren't going to be immune, they were going to die. And any quest content that was associated with them was going to go with them. And it did inform a lot of our choices. And it made things difficult because we had to construct a story. For example, General Oliver and Legate Lanius don't actually appear in the game until the point in time where you can actually kill them. And there are ways you can design around that, like have them talk to you through other means or appear to you through an intercom or things like that. But you do have to structure the game around those choices. And the earlier, as developers, that we make those choices, the easier it is for designers to deal with.
Yeah, I think as designers, we have like a love-frustration relationship with choice. Like when we're brainstorming about what a quest can be or what an area can be, we love talking about all the different things we can allow players to do over the course of playing the game. They can kill everyone, take a pacifist route, or do some combination thereof of the quest design. Then when we get time to actually implementing the quest, the frustration sets in where we look at, by allowing all these options, that's 37 global variables we have to track and maintain. The conversation nodes go from like a fairly simple 30 node conversation to 300 by reacting to all the possible choices they could have made in that area and in previous regions, and coming back to this area after making choices in future regions. So we have to strike a balance between all the things we want to do and the amount of time we have, the limits that we have to impose on ourselves on, okay, we're not going to allow the person to go into the tavern and take up a position sweeping the floor, because while that might be a choice they can make, it's not an interesting one. It doesn't really, there's a minority of players who actually want to do that, and it's not really going to improve the overall quality of the game by the amount of work put into that single choice. So realistically, when we're starting a game, we have broad dreams of how much choice we're going to be able to have in the game, and then quickly during production we realize, okay, here's what we can more realistically do given the time frame and constraints, and that kind of narrows down our focus, which sometimes it feels like, I really love this choice, we can't put it in the game, but the amount of time we would have spent on that means time spent away from other choices. So it allows us to focus our efforts and make what we have put into the game even better and more rewarding for players. So it's that balance during development we have to try and find. And it's different on every game, finding that balance point.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that not all player choice is created equal. Some choices lead to bad experiences, and that's not what you want to provide. You want to always provide the choices that lead to a good experience in the game, in the story. And I think in the case of what if you could kill a really big villain right away? If you think about, Batman versus Joker or Sherlock and Moriarty, it'd be a very different story if you start watching the movie or the show and then Batman kills Joker in the first 5 minutes. It'd be like, okay, where does Dark Knight go from here? So I think knowing when to build anticipation and allow it later on can be really good.
Are there any other concrete examples of choices you really wanted to give the player, but just there was no way to reconcile it with, breaking the entire game?
There was one villain that we tried. We played around with the idea of letting you attack him immediately, and it would lead to combat, and he would just kill you straight out. And we kept getting a lot of feedback that's this is really frustrating. Why are you making it so easy for me to attack him, and then it just leads to a game over? So we ended up reworking it a little bit to where you fight him and he just kind of evades you and is oh, come on, do you really want to do this? And you have a way to back out of it. And then later on you can fight him near the end of the game and triumph against him and stuff like that. But it's again, you don't want to push something that's actually frustrating to the player. You always want to present a lot of options that are any one of these are going to lead to something really fun and surprising and enjoyable.
Are there times when you also have to restrict player choice because you really, for the plot or the story of the game, this story moment has to go this particular way? We all remember when Eris had her little incident, or we found out we were Darth Revan all along, but in a world where the player could have simply locked Eris in the closet and kept her from going there, how do you lead the player to those crucial, memorable moments?
I think you don't want to frustrate people. You don't want to make them think. You don't want to put them in a situation where normally the rules and the expectations of the story and the world are used against them, where they go like, why wouldn't I could have just done this thing. This doesn't make any sense. So there are always times where you have to allow someone to live or die at a certain time, and as long as you don't kind of work against the player's expectations in a way that just feels frustrating, like, you taught me the rules of how this story in this world worked, and then you pulled the rug out from under me. Just as long as you don't do that, usually you can manage that. Otherwise, maybe you have to make the choice there of allowing them to interfere with that and figuring out maybe this is a valid choice. Maybe we do want to allow them to, maybe the thing that they're trying to prevent still happens, but there's something that's mitigated and the game actually cares about that. Like if this person has to die, but the player can do something really heroic and cool that everyone recognizes, like, oh, you tried, and there's a consequence to that feels like it's meaningful, that can, help the player feel not frustrated by the fact that you kind of just didn't let them get their way.
And I mean, sometimes you can set things up so that, like, maybe you can't necessarily murder this guy right now, but you can spend some time like building up your character or like advancing the story or whatever, and then you can kill them later. So it's still kind of satisfying, even if you have to keep people from doing things that don't necessarily work, or sometimes like, sometimes you get into situations where it's like, well, I have this character, and if I kill him right away, then, game over. Like, what do I do with the story from this point? There's nothing for me to tell. And it's not so bad if you are killing a character that, like, maybe they just don't give you as much information, So you don't get as much of the story, but it's not like the end of the world type thing. But I mean, we usually try to limit how many people you don't have choices with, I guess. Like, it's again, it goes back to that balancing act of making sure that, all your choices are meaningful and that they're meaningful at the right time.
I think one of the things that when you're working on games and trying to develop a narrative for them, you have to not look at it as you are telling a story, because ultimately the player is the one who needs to have the control over what happens. Now, obviously, you can restrict what choices they have by what dialogue options you give them, what gameplay mechanics you introduce, but once you start thinking, I am telling this story and the player is going to do this now, that is never going to happen. The player is going to try and do something else at that point, or they're going to feel like they are being railroaded into a situation that isn't fun for them or doesn't work to what their character is trying to do. So you need to try and design the narrative in a way that you're creating a situation there's conflict and drama involved in that, but then give the player the way to resolve those in multiple different options, like to Josh's point, based on their expectations of who their character is, what the game systems allow them to do, and not try and force that this one thing must happen in this one specific way because that's the story I've decided is going to happen. There's a certain amount of, you need to like step back and let go of that idea as a designer that telling the story is a collaboration between you and the player and not something that you have total control over.
Yeah. It's great if you have cool moments, but if the player is always going to see that cool moment at exactly the same time and with no input into it and the same outcome, you're actually just kind of offering a movie moment at that point. You're not really offering a cool story, in my opinion. I sort of feel like the best game moments come out of providing a great moment and then trusting the player to find it. I was excited to play the original BioShock, and it had very few cutscenes that were actually forced on you. There were a few, but a lot of things just happen, and they expect you to maybe look out the window and see what's happening in the water outside, or not. I remember playing Far Cry 2, and it had this great little mechanic where they have these buddies that would come along with you, and sometimes they get hurt, and you could walk over to them, help them with some morphine, and they'd be like, oh, that was great, we did that mission together, and you get a little point of like history with them. You're like, oh, I should do missions with them, right? But you do that long enough and they can get killed. And I remember having a mission where I took a guy along with me and he got shot, and I went down to give him some morphine and he just begged for more. And so I gave him more morphine and he begged for more, and then I had the option to shoot him or abandon him. And so I pulled out my gun and he grabbed it, put it up against his chin, and I executed him, and I felt really terrible because I didn't have to get him killed in this mission. I just brought him along and he died. Horribly. But it wasn't part of the critical path or anything like that. It was just a great moment that the developers put in there, and I stumbled upon it, and that's good storytelling. So,
Is it more difficult in your mind to make a game that tells a good story, or a game that allows a player to tell their own amazing, unique story, like the one you just told?
the latter. I think you should allow players to make great stories. I I think the best stories I've played so far have been playing Dwarf Fortress, This War of Mine, and Crusader Kings, games like that. Things that sort of present a tool set for really rich, elaborate, self-imposed narrative. I think John Madden's a great storytelling game if you've got a good friend who plays football with you. I don't much understand the footballs, but if you are into it, like you just, every time you sit down and play that game with a friend, you have a great story that comes out of it.
I think definitely agree. Like telling a linear story it's much easier to do in a game. It's also something that's well understood. People have been telling linear stories for centuries, so it's not like this is something new. Trying to give the player tool sets that allow them to tell their own story in a comprehensible fashion is a much more challenging experience because it's easy to just throw in randomness and hope the player can string some kind of narrative together from there. Trying to integrate those moments to work within the game systems where it feels like the player has some agency and control over what happens, and then the moments that come together have some inherent like relationship to each other. That's much more of a challenging experience because it requires narrative and systems and everyone on the team to be communicating much more closely together to ensure that the game that they're making has a consistent vision and an idea of what they're trying to communicate to players.
And I will say that it's not necessarily easy to tell a linear story in a game. I mean, studios like Naughty Dog, I mean, they tell essentially movies within games, and they're using the language of cinema to do that, and they're telling it in a way that is very recognizable as if you were just watching a movie. And that is hard as hell. It's very difficult on its own, but it's using a different type of storytelling. It's using cinematic storytelling. What our type of role-playing games typically do is a different type of challenge, and the pacing is a lot different. A linear storytelling game can be maybe like 10 hours, 12 hours, something like that. A role-playing game can be 80, 100 hours. And so there's a lot of little stories, and a lot of cases you're looking for thematic links that you can draw between things. It's kind of like a bigger picture experience. And a lot of times it's interesting when people talk about role-playing games, they're like, how do you feel about the story? When they start talking about the details, they'll talk about companion interactions and things like that aren't actually part of the critical path. So when we, as designers in role-playing games, think about story, it's much broader than literally the plot, which is a challenge, but it's also very cool because it allows us to explore things in a lot of different places in the game.
I mean, pretty much what they said. I think it's just more moving parts to keep track of, juggling with one ball versus like 12, I think you can make a very strong linear narrative and it's super enjoyable. Like, I love them to death. And then if you try to make a role-playing type narrative where the main, like, what people really like is like, oh my gosh, my experiences were so different than yours. This happened to me, but it didn't happen to you, blah, blah, blah. It's basically you're taking a lot of the plot and you're fracturing it and you're providing different crossroads for people. I think, like, two of my favorite games, different examples would be Wolf Among Us, where as part of the investigation, you can choose, do I want to go to Area B or Area A or Area B? Which one you choose could save a life, versus Until Dawn, where you have very many like different choices that will determine whether someone lives or dies. So people playing the first one are like, okay, did this character live or die for you? Whereas in the second one, it's like you could have completely different experiences. They're both super enjoyable, but I think the way that you build them is completely different.
Yeah, coming from a level design standpoint, it's definitely much more difficult to try and have a branching narrative because it's like Brian was saying, there's a lot more variables you have to keep track of and what order people do things in. But at the same time, it's also kind of really satisfying knowing that, you're giving players all those choices and they can go do all of these different things. But yeah, it's definitely much more difficult than attempting to do something that's just telling a story. So.
Does it ever worry you or bother you as a writer or a narrative designer to think, man, I built this world with all of these possible variables and narrative branches, and I worked really hard on this one piece I'm really fond of, but the player made a choice and now they're never going to see it?
I think one of the things that when you make the decision to make that type of game, you just have to embrace the idea that only a certain part of your audience is actually going to see any one thing. Like right now, my office is right outside where our QA area is. So as we're working on Tyranny, it's been a lot of fun because I'll be talking with designers about how we're going to implement an area, and then a week later I'll hear QA talking about the new content that just went in. And there was maybe a few months ago, one of the QA guys discovered this thing that had been in the game for probably 4 or 5 months, but he hadn't tested this route yet. And he's like, oh, I just killed this character. And everyone else in QA was like, no, that's not possible. No, you couldn't do that. And he starts telling the story of how he got that to happen, and they start debating back and forth about, like, is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? Is that going to cause an imbalance in the game? And, like, they start talking about other choices they could make that could lead to that same moment, or how that same thing might happen to other characters, and start writing a test plan to see whether those things could happen. So, like, even though one individual player may not see a certain moment in the game, the community of players talk about those moments and get that idea of the different experiences each one had, and it helps build like this shared narrative and understanding of what the game is and the various options that are available. And I think that's a lot cooler than a guaranteed narrative you're going to see.
Yeah, I actually kind of like being able to design all these little experiences that some people will see and some people won't, because then it's really fun to see, like, who actually discovered these things that, like, you know, I mean, I'll spend like a whole bunch of time like working on something that I think is really cool, and then I sit there and I look at it and I'm like, all right, so if they do this, and this exactly, then they'll see this thing. So that's like, you know, a small portion in like a bigger branch, but at the same time, like, for those players, they get this really cool moment that all these other people haven't seen before. So it's, on the one hand, it's kind of like, well, any given player is only going to see, like, you know, maybe 20% of what I've actually put into this. But then when you account for everyone, and then like all the different conversations they can have, it's actually really cool to see like how the experiences are different for each person based upon, like, so it's kind of like you look at people experiencing your work as a whole, as opposed to like one individual player and how much of like the fraction of the amount of time you've put into it.
I think whenever I write something where I have this moment where I'm like, oh, this is really fun, or like, this is cool, and I think about like, oh, well, only a certain amount of people are going to see this, I immediately try to think about the counterbalance and be like, if you don't choose this, what are you experiencing, and how can I make it just as cool? So.
Yeah, and I think we always, as narrative designers, we have to look at critical information. Like, we don't want players to miss anything that's extremely important. The rest of the stuff that's about, you know, personal character development and growth for side characters, the way a plot goes, you just have to embrace it. And sometimes it can just be a goofy thing. Like, I was remembering one of the designers that worked on Icewind Dale 2, Damien Folletto, had this in a very late game area. He had this, I don't think it was a goblin character. It was some weird little demon guy who would appear and he would start chastising you, and he's getting ready to attack you. And he wrote it, there were, for some other quests in the game, we realized that we had a dead male body, a dead female body, and a dead cat. And they were for different quests, but you could just keep them in your inventory. And so when you got to that point in the game, the guy starts chastising you, like, you know what you got yourself in? And he's like, wait a minute. He's like, are you carrying a bunch of dead bodies around with you? And he like starts going off. He's like, you know what? I don't think I really signed up for this. You seem like you're kind of crazy. I don't want to deal with you. I'll just take my leave. So a few people, not everyone, but a few people carry dead bodies around with them for the whole game, and they're really heavy too. So it's like, okay, you're taking up a lot of inventory space with that. So that sort of stuff is really, really funny and cool.
It's certainly time-consuming to write the same quest 5 times over to provide 5 different ways to do it, but I think it's deeply satisfying. I'm actually kind of sad to think that there, might be players who will, discover a bunch of choices and be like, oh, but that wasn't enough choices. And there's this thought of like, oh, well, how much choice is enough? When is it enough? Players are always happy to, buy a game that provides them a bunch of choices. They're rarely willing to pay the price tag for the development of all the choices that they actually have in the game, or would want to see in the game. But yeah, I actually kind of like the thought that no one sees exactly the same, or hopefully sees not close to the exact same thing when they play through the game. When I was a kid and finished playing, Final Fantasy III or whatever, the conversations I had with my friends about it were, hey, well, let's talk about the same experience. Wasn't that neat? Great. But if, we had massively different experiences through the game, that would have been a much better memory.
Well, coming at it from the angle of, perhaps all the choice in the world, we touched upon this very briefly. Anybody can hand a player an open world or a sandbox game and say, go nuts, and hope that by random happenstance, that player will get a really unique and compelling story that they can tell their friends about. What elements of direction or design would you say are important at a minimum to give people an actual structure to those stories to lend themselves to those kind of events.
I'd say you certainly need conflict, factions, and a very nice-looking table that somebody wants to flip.
For me, I think if you're going to create a system where you're trying to give the players the ability to tell their own stories, the most important thing is making sure that players quickly understand the mechanics and what their agency is in the game, so they understand like how they make their choices and how those decisions actually affect the game. If you're having random things happen and the player doesn't understand how their input affects that, it just feels like random things are happening that they have no control over, and it doesn't end up feeling like a satisfying experience, because it just feels like this happened because the game rolled a dice and decided that's going to happen, not because of anything I did. The most successful stories that come from like player agency, like Crusader Kings 2 or games like Civilization, where basically it's just a system. There's not like a narrative that is trying to be told. You always know exactly what you're doing in order to affect the outcome, and then the story you build over the course of the game comes from those actions. Like I was talking to a friend last night who plays Crusader Kings 2, and he was talking about he had decided he was going to try and see if he could game the system by always picking spouses for his lineage that had like either the beautiful or genius traits to try and like build up his bloodline and make it like the most powerful possible. So he married his daughter off to this foreign noble who had the genius trait, and the marriage was cemented, and then like 2 years later he was assassinated by this new son. He's like, well, I found the smartest guy around and put him in a position where he's going to be benefiting from killing me. That's kind of what should happen. It's exactly that. So, like those type of moments are ones where, because he knew exactly what he did and what the result made sense from that action, it told a great story for him and the choices he made. When it's too much randomness, you can't make that connection, and it just ends up being just chaos.
I try to look at motivation first, so giving the player a clear direction, but also trying to ensure that a variety of players will be motivated to pursue that goal. So I think about the D&D party, if you've ever played with like, this guy's lawful good, this guy's chaotic neutral, and you give a quest, and it's like, the chaotic neutral guy's like, gold, I'm interested in that, and the paladin's like, that does not interest me. And it's like, God damn it, like, I gotta find a way to motivate this party of assholes to work together. And so I try to think of both the sort of the self-interested motivations as well as the more altruistic motivations. And I think that when we do a good job, the player feels like they're more naturally drawn through a lot of story elements rather than being forced to go through them. One thing that other than it is my fault that you wound up going in a weird direction at the beginning of Fallout New Vegas, so I apologize for that. Let's move on. But one of the things that it does pretty well is it introduces you to all these different factions, but it doesn't force you to have to take sides necessarily at that point. You can do the quests associated with them, but you're not forced to make like a long-standing alliance at that point. You see what the Legion is doing at Nipton. You see how the NCR is kind of handling or mishandling Prim, what the Power Gangers are up to. And it takes a while, you're like, wow, this place is pretty screwed up. Where's that guy that shot me in the head? And then by the time you get to Benny, you've been exposed to pretty much all the major factions, other than perhaps Mr. House at that point. So you have a pretty good idea of what these groups are all about. But technically, you weren't actually forced on the critical path to make any decisions or alliances with them. In fact, at the beginning of New Vegas, if you are very clever, you can go straight north, be careful, you can go straight north from Good Springs and make your way into the Strip and confront Benny. You don't actually have to go through any of those parts. So when it's constructed well, the player sort of feels naturally pulled through it, and if they miss little bits, that's okay because it's about the overall experience. But yeah, you always have to provide clear direction. If it's completely aimless, one of my favorite games is Darklands from 1992. You have no direction at all when you start that. Yes, thank you. The one person who's played it. You have no direction at all, and the game will just slaughter you, and it takes forever to like actually get the plot thread. But once you do, there's this cool satanic conspiracy that you can unravel over the course of the game. So you do have to provide some direction, and it has to be clear and provide for different motivations, because again, this goes back to the type of personality you have and how you want to express the quests and make decisions in them. But as long as you do that, you can be a little more light-handed with other plot elements and factions and sort of just let the player experience them.
by the way, we'll be doing another panel about motivating a party of assholes at next PAX.
It's called being a dungeon master.
Yeah, I think Josh pretty much covered it. Like, a lot of it is just making sure your player has the motivation early on to get them through stuff, and then at that point, like, as long as everything that they kind of encounter like makes sense within like the world and what they've already learned, yeah, player motivation can go a long way towards making sure that they end up ultimately where they're supposed to be, and like the journey in between can be, you know, whatever the player has decided.
Well, speaking of motivation, this kind of ties into, let's say, morality in video games, which is always kind of a tricky one. Is it difficult to write a compelling story or convey an emotional journey for a character in a game when the player behind that character might have a completely different morality than the direction that would lead? I mean, like, you know, with Fallout New Vegas, if the player comes into it and my morality is, I just got left in a shallow grave, I'd rather just be left alone and take off. Where would their motivation to be pulled into that quest line then come from?
Well, I think we certainly have to, we can't ever solve the player who fires up a game and says, I don't want to play this game. Like, okay. Sure. Glad you did that. So we assume that if they're playing the game, they want to play it at least at some point. And I guess the idea is, I'd say it's actually in some ways easier to convey emotion when the player might feel differently and when you give them a choice. If you're showing a player a linear story and they're just watching the protagonist do things, oftentimes the protagonist will make decisions that they don't like. If there's decisions, at least you might not have offered all the decisions that speak to all the player moralities, and oftentimes they'll be like, no, none of these choices fit me, but at least they'll find a best fit. So I think providing choices that even though they don't always speak to every single emotional range of all the players who are going to play it, you're at least giving them a choice of 3, choice of 5, choice of 7, which is better than just watching the protagonist do something that you would have completely disagreed with.
I was actually thinking about this while Josh was talking about Fallout New Vegas, because the way I played it, I'm like the worst player for a developer ever, because when you have a dialogue option to an NPC, I'm always secretly thinking that I'm lying. I'm like, sure, I'm totally on your side. Like, I will definitely do this for you and not murder you as soon as I can immediately after. So I think, and it's interesting too, because that brand of evil is like not super common in games. A lot of times you have like a, hey, I'm a really good person and I came to help you out, or you have a like, I'm raging psychotic and I'm gonna tell you that I'm gonna murder everyone right away. But I think that one of the things that interests me is that gray area of like being kind of charismatic and doing things for people but totally screwing them over if you can, or like having bad intentions the whole time. So yeah, I don't think that actually answers anything, but it's really fun to like add into the game, yeah.
There's a something that I always thought that was very interesting, and it's interesting because of the series is so oriented around virtue. The Ultima series, starting with 4, is really focused on the virtues and sort of upholding the virtues. And so you're supposed to play the avatar as a good person, and the game mechanically will punish you if you don't do that. But what's interesting is that the way that the game starts with the fortune teller wagon is it forces you to choose between virtues. It puts you in a situation where you have to favor honesty over humility, or spirituality over honesty, and those are the more difficult choices because you're being forced to pick between 2 good things. And that's usually where the more interesting player conflicts come from, is here are 2 bad things, you have to pick one. Here are 2 good things, they each have a bad side. Which bad side do you find less offensive? And whenever we set up situations like that, I think players tend to find them a lot more compelling than, well, I decided to play the evil character, so I'm going to pick the evil option. Because they whine, and I think that's, you know, in Tyranny does a good job of showing, you know, here's this world of assholes. No longer just a party of assholes, but
The entire world.
and so you're really like, okay, these are a bunch of, you know, just they're kind of horrible people overall. And so you're really choosing between, you know, these sort of bad groups and bad people, and you're emphasizing certain things over another, which I think is again an interesting choice, just as interesting as choosing between 2 virtuous options.
Very cool. Now that's the new marketing sub-bullet is Tyranny, a world of assholes. All right, so we're coming up on about 15 minutes remaining in the session, so I'd love to take questions at this point. So anyone who would like to ask Anything about what we've discussed or other Obsidian-based questions, please line up at the microphone. Sir, you were up right away, so why don't we start there?
Strategically, yes. Hi, as a voice actor here in town, I'd love to hear the answer to this question. If any of you have a preference, if the main protagonist, whether male or female, if you prefer them to be voiced or voiceless?
I like voiced, but that's just me. I mean, I don't know if there's like a strong mechanical reason for it. I just like to hear, like when I play a game, it doesn't have to be a 100% representation of myself. I'm choosing to, you know, be another person, even if I'm role playing, you know. So I kind of like being able to pick like what type of voice that I have, and then stick with it the whole game, yeah.
I think fully voiced games is like a market standard, so you've got job security. From my own preference, I think an unvoiced protagonist is better. A choice of 5 is great, because I don't think anybody sounds like I sound upstairs, which is a good thing. No one should sound like that. But there's always going to be a disconnect. It's like, oh, that's what I sound like? Yeah, okay, whatever. And usually I just hope that it's Jennifer Hale is what I sound like, because that's just way better. But like, yeah, so I think you're always going to see voice protagonists in most games for the time being, because I just think it's become a industry standard that if you don't have that, you're not a fully complete game. So
I think it depends on the scope of character choice that you have. So if I have, you know, 6 races and various genders and classes and all these different attitudes and things like that, and there's a ton of dialogue choices, then I kind of prefer it to be unvoiced. Not just because as a developer I don't want to handle all that shit, but also because there's just such a range and scope of options being given to me. I kind of want to just let the text define what that stuff is, and I also do know as a dev that it limits how you write things. But then again, like a game like Alpha Protocol that has Mike Thornton or Adam Jensen in Deus Ex, those are characters where their scope of expression is defined around a very specific character, and those are role-playing games. And so for a game like games like those, I think it's totally cool to do a voice protagonist.
Thank you.
Thank you. Over here, please.
Hey, is this on? Okay. Last PAX, there was a panel with a bunch of Obsidian folks. I can't remember if it's the exact same mix as last time, but you guys talked about how happy you were to finally have your own IP, you know, like Pillars of Eternity and stuff like that. And now you have Tyranny coming out. I'm looking forward to that too. Do you guys have any plans of opening up any other IPs that are outside of like a traditional RPG fantasy setting?
Yes.
Cool.
All right. Sir, I believe you had lined up prior, but we'll switch off. Please.
Okay, so you try to do where your games you like have multiple choices for characters. Well, what about when you come to an ending? Because an ending can be just as important as the rest of it. How do you like try to do it where the ending fits how you want to, or for multiple different ways for the ending to come out?
I think maybe the question is, after all of the choices, how do you then funnel those into a set of discrete endings? Am I paraphrasing correctly?
Yeah.
All right.
Well, at least with something like Tyranny, we and like things like Fallout New Vegas, it's a lot easier to kind of have the ending just be defined by, you know, the stuff that you've done in the game. Because like in New Vegas, you know, the end game is mostly like a series of slides that goes over like all the stuff that you've done through the game. But it's a lot harder when you have things like like the, you know, the Mass Effect series where like they only had like certain endings, but they also didn't have as many choices. So it just kind of it depends like you kind of have to know from the beginning like how you want to handle your ending, and it really just kind of depends on what kind of role-playing game you're making.
yeah.
We could actually track like almost every choice that you make, but at the same time, I think what makes it feel really satisfying is if it's a really big thing that you caused, or a really big choice. So like when I played the first BioShock, I got the bad ending, and I was like, you know, because I didn't know that the little girls were like little girls until too late. But then like at the same time, if I'm playing a role-playing game and one of the endings is like, oh, and you saved this person's cat in this one village, I'd be like, I really don't care, you know? So it's like, so you kind of want it to be like the stuff that you did that really affected the game and like, you know, caused a huge impact for either yourself or, you know, the other characters of the world.
think it's like Josh said about setting up New Vegas. We knew from the start what the end was going to be, and it's important to choose an ending that is like not like this person's going to be here for this final showdown. Like somebody A and somebody B might survive for a conflict, and then you just keep it open, and you start from the very beginning knowing that you're coming towards like an open end, and then you try to make all of the pieces massage towards that ending.
I think it's also important to, I don't think it's very satisfying when players feel like they just get to an end and there are 5 buttons to press and they can just reload and see each of the endings. I think it's important to, at some point in the game, start steering the player down a certain road that is going to constrain some of their end game options. So for us, in Pillars, you make alliances with the gods that may influence later on what you're going to do. In Fallout New Vegas, you make your alliance, and there's a point of no return where it's like, okay, if you make this alliance, Caesar's Legion is going to be permanently forever pissed off at you. But then within the ending, there are still choices to make. And then I think one of the most interesting things you can do is then take your previous choices that you've made throughout the game and then say how the end game choice influenced the specific ending you had. So in New Vegas, the communities will wind up in very different circumstances, regardless of, or I shouldn't say regardless of what, based on what you did with them and also who you left in charge. So if you leave NCR in charge, Good Springs winds up very differently than if you have the Legion in charge. And I think when you get that like really wide spectrum of reactivity, the player's choices feel meaningful throughout the game, and they really feel like, wow, like all these things tie together in a really interesting way.
Thank you. All right, over here, sir.
Yeah, I'd like to get the panel's thoughts on creating urgency in the main storyline. With a lot of RPGs, the world, it's established really early on that the world's ending and there's demons coming in, but since video game logic, we can go enter the archery tournament or kill rats and sword. As it relates to player choice, how do you sort of, even if it's artificial, create that urgency that the player needs to get going on this, or how do you justify it with all the side quests around?
That's hard.
Well, you can give them 200 days to find the water chip, but that seems to make players angry.
Well, I think part of it comes back to like what I was saying, that at a certain point you have to like let go, as you're not trying to tell a specific story, you're trying to create a situation and give the player the tools to resolve it. So you can have dialogue where people keep saying like, yeah, I can trade this with you, but you know, you might want to go deal with the big bad over there that's about to kill us all. Like reminding them of the situation they're trying to deal with, but forcing them to accomplish something within like a really strict timeline, or restricting their ability to do certain things based on the situation you've created just leads to frustration on the player's part, because there's times where it's like, oh, I'm supposed to go kill this guy, but I really need to go back and buy that sword upgrade so I'm powered up enough to go in and deal with the final boss. And it's like, I can't trade with you. You need to go kill the final boss. It's like, I need the damn sword to kill the final boss. Stop getting in my way.
Games often use urgency early on to put you onto a plot line just to get your attention focused. But usually early on is when you're trying to learn the game, and it sucks to be failing because there's a timeline that's burning down. And you're like, hey, but I'm still learning the game. Don't tell me what to do. I think it's very tough to imply urgency, because also people sit down to play games at their own speed and not fail miserably because they didn't juggle everything. Like there's real life for that.
I think timelines, especially, can be a very tricky thing to do, especially if they're very long timelines, like years and things like that. I think that a short timeline can give that sense of urgency, and the player is focused enough on it that it'll push them through it. But if you have the big like Pikmin length sort of like things, or even Fallout 1, you're like, water what? Oh shit, the game's over. That like, in addition to being frustrating from a narrative perspective, you screwed the player out of the whole time they spent playing until that point. Whereas if it's like, no, this quest line, which will probably take you 2 to 3 hours, does have a strict time limit on it, that's something that where if the player kind of dawdles a little bit, they're not really losing that much time to get back on track. So it is a delicate balancing act. Also, if you make it too obviously fake, players are smart enough to see that, and it feels cheap. So it's hard.
I think one of the worst examples I had was playing Paper Mario, and it's a turn-based game, and there's one point you're in the bottom of a dungeon, and it's like, oh, now that there's this bomb about to go off, you have X number of minutes to get back to the top of the dungeon and escape, and it's a turn-based combat system. So as you're sitting there trying to going through a turn-based, waiting for enemies to act, you can see that the timer ticking down the entire time. It's like, just move, damn it, I don't care about your damn AI, I want to get out of this dungeon. So creating that type of urgency when it's contrary to the game systems just guarantees player frustration. So you want to try and pick systems that work with your game rather than against them.
Thanks.
Thank you. Sir.
Hi. So it might be a little like coming back on a point that you already covered during the presentation, but I was wondering on how do you handle the frustrations that might come from the players in the case that the story you want to tell has a major plot twist? And how do you introduce those during like the storytelling of the game where it's like open-ended and then suddenly like everything shifts and you have to break some of the patterns that you introduced to the players previously, and the players are like, damn, I can't prevent that. That sucks.
I don't like twists personally. No, it is hard. I think that my preference usually, like, it's not that you can't use twists, but if your whole plot hinges on twists, it can be difficult to set up and pull off. It's much easier in linear storytelling. If you don't have a lot of sort of critical path breakpoints in the story, you can choose to do it at one specific time, and then it'll work better than in other places. If you try to do it all over the place, then it can sometimes just be a mess. My own personal preference, and then I'll shut up because other people can say things, is I like turns, like the sort of idea that you start to get to know a person or a group, and then over time you start to see more of them, and you're like, you're not that cool. You know, like, you're not as cool as I thought you were, or like, you're kind of racist. Like, I like you, but you are kind of racist. And actually, Matt and Eric Fenstermaker, Matt's a huge racist. Matt and Eric Fenstermaker had some fun stuff with, he wrote Haravius for Pillars of Eternity, and Eric Fenstermaker wrote Adair, who, your buddy Adair. He's a really nice guy. He's a really, really cool dude. And he's a casual racist. And you don't really realize that until you get, I mean, he makes a couple of comments, and you're like, yeah, that's fine. And then you get Haravius, and he just starts saying racist stuff, and Haravius is like, what are you doing? But it does change the player's expectation. I think most people still like Adair, but recognizing like, there are some things about this group or this character that are not that cool. I think changing those, or this group that I thought was super bad, actually there are some cool things about them. So I like turns more than twists because I think it feels a little more natural for the player and less about the sort of super narrative buildup.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that plot twists can be a little bit like a roller coaster, where if you're like going super hard around a turn and the person gets thrown out of the cart, they're not going to enjoy that. A bad plot twist kind of feels like that, where you're like, where did this even come from? I think when it feels really enjoyable, it's definitely more of playing with expectations. So you introduce and you teach people like what to expect, and then you twist it or turn it in a slight way where it's kind of like a pleasant surprise, but they learned that it would be coming. So one example of that is the beginning of The Dark Knight, where you see basically the Joker's introduction feels really like, oh my gosh, that was amazing. And I really think it's because they spent a good 5 to 10 minutes introducing the mechanic of all of these bad guys are robbing this bank, and every step of the way, a group of them gets killed off by the one who advances. And so when you get to the very end, you're thinking that this last guy is definitely going to get killed off by whoever arrives in the bus or whatever, but then it turns out that he's the Joker and he survived it and killed everybody else, right? And so they spent like 5 minutes of building this element of like you waiting for like, oh man, and now this guy's going to get killed off and then you're going to learn something else, but really he turns it around on the audience and creates a special moment. And I think a lot of like successful plot twists spend the time building that, so you need to like leave breadcrumbs for your player and teach them what's going to be coming.
Yeah, if you include the player in the expectation, like there's a mystery and you want to figure it out. When the twist comes out of nowhere, then it just feels dumb. But to use another Christopher Nolan example, not enough people have seen The Prestige, I would bet. And The Prestige does a good job because the whole thing is about figuring out like, what is he doing? And you know, like, and so when you finally do learn what they're doing, it's cool, and it doesn't just feel like, oh, okay, thanks for that little tidbit.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, panel.
Hi.
Earlier on, you were discussing giving players the freedom to kill NPCs and how you design around that. I was wondering if you think there's any scenarios where it'd be appropriate to let player actions result in an unwinnable state, or the end of the game? I understand that's something you'd want to avoid, but just any way you might consider using it.
I think there are places where we do that, where if the players made a series of choices where the only way to logically get them out of an unwinnable state is to just violate all the rules we've established for the game, that feels like it's better to allow that to play out and give the player like a cool end state that's like only exists in that one scenario, and they can tell their friends like, oh yeah, I did this thing and the game ended prematurely and I got this cool end slide, and that becomes a moment.
Does that.
Yeah. I think that's the better way to handle it, because generally you don't want the players to get to the point where they feel like they've run out of options unless you've like clearly telegraphed that you're going down this path, and if you keep going down it, you're going to like limit your options completely. And then at that point you just need to like let it play out and make sure that it feels satisfying in its own way, or the player got something unique out of it as a result of that failure.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of being respectful of the player's time, because they sit down to play the game and they have only so many hours to live their life. I thought like Morrowind did a good job of saying like, hey, you killed somebody who probably is important, just saying. And you could keep playing, but you've been told by the game, like, look, if you really care about seeing the end state, you maybe want to hit reload or you're going to waste all the hours to come. So I think it's actually fine to let players be in an unwinnable situation, but you always have to let them know, otherwise you're just sort of breaking that contract of like, they bought entertainment software from you and you're now dicking them around for hours and hours.
There was a debate when we were working on New Vegas about whether we should inform players when they break quests. Because in some cases you have no idea that a character is involved in a quest. So, for example, if in Novak, if you just start killing people, Daisy Whitman will come out. I don't know if people know Daisy Whitman is an old lady who lives in Novak. You're like, wow, this lady has a lot of hit points. And it's because she's an Enclave like helicopter, but she's 30th level. But you can kill her, and then it says, you know, quest failed for Auld Lang Syne, which is Arcade Gannon's companion quest. But, you know, once we establish that, like, hey, dude, like, you don't actually know what this quest is, but you just failed it, you know, I think it's about, you know, sort of saying, we're not going to let you find this out later when you're going to be super pissed about it. We're going to tell you now, and if you're okay with it, like, you can just keep on playing or you can reload. There's another example I can think of where there's an end state that might be undesirable, and someone will tell you, like, hey, if you don't do this thing, a bunch of bad stuff is going to happen. Like, we can still go this way, but it's going to be bad. There's a group, Travis Stout wrote the Misfits, which are this little band of NCR dudes that suck. They're like the worst troop in the NCR. And one of the ways you can handle it, because they're underperforming soldiers, you can just give them a bunch of psycho. And you're like, psycho is this combat drug that just, you know, it's like PCP basically. So you're like, you know, you guys will be great. Like, you're going to fight great. And they're like, okay, whatever. And people are like, I don't know if this is really a great idea, like giving these guys a bunch of drugs. And then you can do that though, and you complete the quest, and at the end of the game, they're brought up on war crimes because they go psycho and they start killing everyone. And so you're like, oh yeah, that's right, I did that. And on a more sort of somber note, we allow you to play through New Vegas for the most part as a pacifist, actually completely as a pacifist. And there's a part where in Honest Hearts, toward the end, if you're trying to save to save the Sorrows, Daniel says, you gotta kill these dudes. And you can say like, no, I don't believe in that. And he's like, motherfucker, like, well, Daniel is his head. But he's like, if you don't kill these guys, they're gonna kill a ton of Sorrows. And you can be like, nope, I'm a pacifist. And a bunch of Sorrows die, and there's a consequence for that. So I think as long as you I tell the player immediately what happened, what the consequence is, or you say like, we can do this, but there's going to be something bad out of it, I think those are both fine.
All right. I've been given the signal that our time is now up, so I want to thank everyone for coming. I'd like to thank my colleagues from Obsidian Entertainment for being here. And I hope everyone has a delightful rest of your last day of PAX. Bye, everyone.